Italy entered World War II with ambition. Mussolini's engineers had drawn up plans for a new breed of dive bomber, sleek, modern, purpose-built. The Savoia-Marchetti SM.85 was meant to be the Regia Aeronautica's answer to the Stuka, the weapon that would rain precision death from Italian skies. But something went terribly wrong. The aircraft that promised devastation delivered only disappointment. Pilots complained it was sluggish. Commanders found it obsolete before it even reached the front lines. And by the time the war truly tested Italy's air power, the SM-85 had already been swept aside. This is the story of the Savoia-Marchetti SM-85, the dive bomber that Italy needed but could never master, and the hard lessons hidden in its failure. The dream of precision. The year was 1939, and dive bombing had become the new gospel of tactical air power. In Spain, during the Civil War, the German Condor Legion had demonstrated what a screaming Ju-87 Stuka could do. It could drop a bomb with surgical accuracy, turning bridges, supply depots, and armored columns into smoking craters with terrifying efficiency. The world took notice, and Italy, always watching Germany with a mix of admiration and rivalry, wanted its own. Mussolini's Italy had grand visions. Il Duce spoke of restoring the Roman Empire, of dominating the Mediterranean, of matching or surpassing the great powers of Europe. But ambition alone does not win wars. Italy needed steel, engines, and above all, modern aircraft. The Regia Aeronautica, Italy's air force, had fought bravely in Spain and Ethiopia. But by the late 1930s, its bomber fleet was aging. The SM-79 Sparviero, the famous Hunchback, was a capable medium bomber and torpedo striker, respected across the Mediterranean. But it was not a dive bomber. It could not deliver the precision strikes that modern warfare demanded. What Italy needed was a dedicated attack aircraft, something that could plunge from the sky, release its payload with pinpoint accuracy, and pull away before ground defenses could respond. The task fell to Savoia-Marchetti, one of Italy's most respected aviation firms. They had built elegant, reliable aircraft for years. Their designers believed they could create something worthy of the Regia Aeronautica's ambitions. And so, in late 1937, the Savoia-Marchetti SM-85 was born. On paper, it seemed promising. A twin-engine dive bomber, heavily armed, with a crew of 3 and a bomb load, respectable enough to threaten any ground target. Its streamlined fuselage and modern lines suggested speed and agility, but war is not fought on paper, and the SM-85 would soon reveal that promise and performance are not the same thing. Design and compromise. The SM-85 was, from the beginning, an attempt to reconcile conflicting demands. It needed to be fast enough to evade enemy fighters, strong enough to endure the brutal stresses of a dive attack, maneuverable enough to strike with precision, and yet it also needed to carry a meaningful bomb load and enough defensive armament to survive. Savoia-Marchetti's engineers settled on a twin-engine layout, 2 Piaggio P7 radial engines, each producing around 340 horsepower, drove the aircraft forward. Not a lot of power, even by late 1930s standards, but the designers hoped efficiency and aerodynamics would compensate. The fuselage was sleek, almost elegant. The cockpit was enclosed, giving the crew some protection from the elements. The wings were of moderate span, fitted with dive brakes to slow the aircraft during its attack run. In theory, this would allow the pilot to line up the target, release the bomb, and pull out without excessive G-forces tearing the aircraft apart. Its armament was respectable. A forward-firing machine gun for the pilot, and 2 more in defensive positions manned by the crew. The bomb bay could carry up to 1,000 kilograms of ordnance, a solid punch if delivered accurately. But therein lay the problem. The SM-85 was not particularly fast. Its top speed hovered around 280 miles per hour, slower than many fighters of the era. Its climb rate was sluggish, and worst of all, its handling in a dive. The very maneuver it was designed to perform was awkward and unforgiving. Pilots who tested the aircraft reported that it felt heavy on the controls. The dive brakes helped, but the aircraft's weight distribution made recovery from a steep dive difficult. Pull too hard, and the wings might buckle. Pull too gently, and you risked slamming into the ground. For a dive bomber, this was a fatal flaw. The SM-85 had been designed with the best intentions, but somewhere between ambition and execution, something had gone wrong. The aircraft that was meant to bring precision to Italian air power had instead become a compromise. Too slow to survive, too unwieldy to excel, too limited to make a difference. Still, Italy had invested resources into the project. A prototype flew in late 1938. Initial tests were acceptable. Not impressive, but acceptable. And so, despite its shortcomings, the SM-85 entered limited production. The dream of Italian dive bombing was about to meet the harsh reality of war. Obsolete before deployment. By the time the SM-85 began to trickle into service in 1939, the world had already moved on. Germany's Ju-87 Stuka had proven itself in Poland, terrorizing defenders with its wailing siren and devastating accuracy. Britain was refining its own tactical bombers. Even Japan was experimenting with carrier-based dive bombers that could strike with shocking precision. But the SM-85 had none of the Stuka's menace. It lacked the speed, the punch, and the psychological terror that made the German dive bomber so effective. Worse, Italy's strategic priorities were shifting. Mussolini had grand visions of Mediterranean dominance, but the reality of Italy's industrial capacity was far more modest. Resources were stretched thin. Factories that might have produced hundreds of SM-85s were instead focused on fighters, medium bombers, and desperately needed transport aircraft. The Regia Aeronautica soon realized what its pilots already knew. The SM-85 was not the weapon they needed. It was too slow to survive against modern fighters. Its bomb load, while respectable, was not enough to justify its vulnerabilities. And its handling characteristics made it dangerous not just to the enemy, but to its own crew. Production numbers reflected this reality. Only a handful of SM-85s were ever completed. Some sources suggest as few as 30 to 40 aircraft in total. Compare that to the thousands of Stukas Germany produced, or the hundreds of SM-79s that served throughout the war, and the disparity is stark. By 1940, as Italy prepared to enter World War II, the SM-85 had effectively been sidelined. It never saw significant combat. It never led a major attack. It was quietly relegated to training duties, where its limitations mattered less. For a dive bomber that had been designed to bring precision and power to Italian air power, this was a quiet, inglorious end. And yet, the SM-85's failure was not merely the failure of a single aircraft. It was a symptom of deeper problems, problems that would haunt Italy throughout the war. The weight of industrial reality. Italy entered World War II with courage, but not capacity. The Regia Aeronautica had skilled pilots, brave crews, and a proud tradition. but it lacked the one thing that mattered most in a modern, industrialized war: the ability to produce and sustain advanced aircraft in the numbers needed to compete. Germany could churn out thousands of fighters and bombers. Britain's factories worked around the clock, replacing losses and refining designs. Even the Soviet Union, despite staggering early defeats, could rely on vast reserves of resources and manpower. Italy had none of these advantages. Its industrial base was modest. Its access to raw materials, steel, aluminum, high-octane fuel, was limited. And its aircraft industry, while capable of producing elegant designs, struggled to scale up production or innovate quickly enough to keep pace with the demands of total war. The SM-85 was a victim of these constraints. It was not a bad design in concept, but it arrived too late, underpowered, and in numbers too small to matter. By the time it might have been refined, improved, and deployed in meaningful strength, the war had already passed it by. Italian pilots, meanwhile, were forced to make do with what they had. The SM-79 remained the backbone of the bomber fleet, a reliable workhorse that served with distinction despite its age. Fighters like the Marchi C-200 and later the C-202 were competitive, even admired by their opponents. But the dream of a dedicated, effective dive bomber remained just that, a dream. For the crews who might have flown the SM-85 into combat, this was perhaps a mercy. The aircraft's limitations would have made every mission a gamble, every dive a test of nerve and luck. But for Italy's war effort, the absence of a viable dive bomber was yet another gap that could not be filled. Lessons in steel and sacrifice. The story of the SM-85 is not simply the story of a failed aircraft. It is a reminder of how wars are won and lost. Wars are not decided by ambition alone, nor by courage, nor even by brilliant strategy. They are decided by the ability to build, supply, and sustain the tools of war. They are decided by factories, by engineers, by logistics, and by the cold arithmetic of production and attrition. Italy had the ambition. It had the courage. But it lacked the industrial might to match its dreams. The SM-85 was designed with the best intentions. Its engineers wanted to give their Air Force a weapon that could strike with precision and power. But without the resources to refine the design, without the time to test and improve it, without the capacity to produce it in meaningful numbers, the aircraft was doomed from the start. And so, the SM-85 faded into obscurity. It became a footnote in the history of Italian aviation, remembered not for its achievements, but for its absence. But even in failure, there are lessons. The SM-85 reminds us that technology alone does not win wars. A brilliant design means nothing if it cannot be produced. A bold concept is worthless if it cannot be sustained. And ambition, no matter how grand, crumbles in the face of industrial reality. For Italy, the SM-85 was a symbol of what might have been, a glimpse of a future that never arrived. For the pilots who might have flown it, it was perhaps a mercy that it remained grounded. And for us, looking back, it is a reminder that in war, the margin between success and failure is often measured not in courage or creativity, but in steel, fuel, and the relentless grinding of industrial capacity. The shadow of what could have been. In museums today, if you search hard enough, you might find fragments of the SM-85 story. A photograph here, a technical drawing there, perhaps a mention in an obscure archive, a footnote in a historian's account. But you will not find a legend. You will not find stories of daring raids, of pilots who became aces flying this machine, of decisive battles won by its intervention. because the SM-85 never had the chance to write those stories. It remains, instead, a ghost of Italian ambition, a machine designed for a war it never fought, in an air force that could not afford to field it. And yet, there is something haunting in its silence. The SM-85 represents all the weapons that were planned but never perfected, all the designs that were drawn but never deployed, all the hopes of engineers and strategists that crumbled under the weight of reality. In that sense, it is not unique. Every nation that fought in World War II had its share of failures, its experimental aircraft that never made it past the prototype stage, its ambitious projects that were quietly cancelled. But the SM-85 is a particularly poignant example, because it was not cancelled due to a fundamental flaw in design. It was not abandoned because a better alternative emerged. It simply faded away, overtaken by events, rendered irrelevant by the pace of war. For Italy, the war would continue without the SM-85. Pilots would fly other aircraft, some excellent, some merely adequate. The Regia Aeronautica would fight bravely across the Mediterranean, in North Africa, in the skies over Malta and Sicily. But the dream of a dedicated dive bomber, the dream of striking with the kind of precision that terrified the enemy, that dream remained unfulfilled. Reflection: the dive bomber that couldn't. The Savoia-Marchetti SM-85 was meant to be Italy's answer to a changing kind of warfare. It was designed to bring precision, to allow Italian pilots to strike with the kind of surgical accuracy that defined modern air combat. But it could not. Not because its designers lacked talent, not because its pilots lacked courage, but because war demands more than good intentions. It demands resources. It demands time. It demands the industrial capacity to turn a concept into reality, to refine a prototype into a weapon, to produce that weapon in the numbers needed to make a difference. The SM-85 had none of these things. And so, it remains a symbol, not of failure, exactly, but of the gap between ambition and capability. For historians, it is a curiosity. For aviation enthusiasts, it is a footnote. For the men who might have flown it, it is a quiet mercy that they never had to test its limits in combat. But for us, looking back, the SM-85 carries a lesson. That in war, the most dangerous enemy is not always the one you face in the sky. Sometimes it is the one you face in the mirror, the limits of your own capacity, the constraints of your own resources, the cold reality that no amount of courage can overcome the arithmetic of industrial war. Italy dreamed of dive bombers that could reshape the battlefield. But dreams, no matter how bold, must be built on steel and sustained by fuel. And when those foundations are lacking, even the most elegant design becomes nothing more than a shadow of what might have been. The SM-85 was a dive bomber that never got the chance to prove itself. But its story is a reminder that wars are won not just by courage, but by the capacity to build, supply, and sustain. If you want to keep exploring the untold stories of the aircraft that shaped history, the ones that succeeded and the ones that failed, make sure you subscribe. Because every aircraft carries a lesson, and every lesson is worth remembering.